Hey, thanks for joining us. Welcome to what I call Won't Fix. If any of you have worked in software, you may be familiar with Won't Fix as a bug status. So it basically says, there's a problem here, but we've decided it's too messy, too complicated, too difficult to fix. So we're just going to leave it as is. And I think for me, I like this because it's summarized a lot of the kinds of problems I've worked on in my career around trust, security, and safety. Sometimes there's a complication, it's difficult, there's trade-offs. But other times the quote unquote, it's complicated excuse is just that, not a good reason to not work on something or fix it. So I figured we would have this as the framing for a lot of the conversations I want to have. I want to have conversations mainly with practitioners, but also with other people involved in these kinds of issues, executives, victims of scams and trust problems out there, journalists who've covered these kinds of things in a meaningful way. And by the way, there's a lot of non-meaningful coverage of these things, but there are some folks who have been able to get very deep on these kinds of problems. That's what we're going to be talking about here. So stay tuned. It's going to be interesting, hopefully educational in some cases. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of AI WTAF. We're really at a point where some of these AI tools, processes, and the ability to automate things like never before are going to lead to some pretty crazy problems. But then also, there's things that just are new versions of old things that have already been happening on the internet for years and years. So I'm hoping we can cover and talk about a lot of those here. Today, I have a really interesting conversation with Jason Zoltak. Jason is the CEO and co-founder of Tofu. Tofu uses AI and machine learning to improve fraud and security problems in recruiting and hiring. I think you'll find the conversation very interesting. And I'd love your feedback. This is obviously the first episode of this podcast. So please send me your feedback. And I'm guessing you probably know me if you're watching this first episode. But if you don't, also looking forward to getting to know the kinds of things you'd like to hear in the future. So enjoy. Thanks. Well, we met recently, and I thought the problem you're working on is really interesting. And I know also, you obviously are a founder, a startup founder, and you're working on this problem, and you have investors and other things. And so maybe you could just tell me a little bit about what you're working on, and then how you got into this, or how the company has evolved over the last couple of years as you've been attacking this problem or working in this space.
Yeah, happy to. So I worked for a company called ShiftSmart before Tofu, which is a labor marketplace for blue collar jobs. So like Circle K goes to ShiftSmart and says, hey, we need 10,000 gas station attendants, and ShiftSmart places them. And I had this idea for Tofu at the time, which was basically like bringing on dormant supply of talent, but for the white collar space, whereas we were doing it for the blue collar space. So we started working on that. I left ShiftSmart to go all in on it. We ended up pivoting into kind of like AI for recruiting, just because the marketplace, good idea, tough to scale. So that was like end of 2023, early 24, so called January 24. And when we had this AI resume screening product, and when we gave it to customers, they all came back, or, the few that we gave it to came back and were like, hey, this is great, but, you're surfacing people named Rob Leathern, but we're getting on the phone with them and they don't sound like Rob. They sound like someone very different than what you might think Rob Leathern would sound like. And we didn't really understand what they were talking about. So we asked customers to send us, video recordings of their interviews and screenshots. My co-founder and I even turned our phones on caller ID off, and we just started calling different resumes to like catch people in lies. And you call someone's, their resume might say Rob, and you would say, hey, is this Matthew? And they would say, yes, it is. And it uncovered this whole thing of like, okay, clearly there's some identity misrepresentation going on. And then doing more and more research, you start learning about, North Korean IT workers and these laptop farms, and basically how since 2020, when everyone went remote because of COVID, a whole new type of fraud exploded with, with AI and just making it super easy to fake credentials and all that. And we put out a very small feature for it, but the buyer response was such a stark contrast between AI resume screening, whereas like for the people that knew it was a problem, it was this hair on fire problem. They're like, I want it now. And it was only a few customers that we were like talking to, but it was such a difference in like the feeling that they had when you presented them with the solution, that it gave me and my co-founder the confidence to be like, well, every single company is building something in the AI recruiting space. This candidate fraud detection feels like a zag when everyone is zigging. And we just decided to go down that path and bet on the fact that it was going to be a much more pervasive issue than it was at the time. And it took a year for people to care about it. And then when, CNBC and Wall Street Journal and all these like larger media outlets started reporting on it, then that's really when things started to take off. And yeah, here we are.
Was there like a moment or a key, like for me, one of the things when I just felt like I wanted to work on AI for scams. I've worked on this in this area before, but then I saw this video of this woman feeding money into a Bitcoin ATM, and I was just like, this should not happen in our society, that someone is feeding their life savings into some ATM with scammers. Like, was there like a moment, or was it more just kind of like a gradual realization that this was an important problem to try to solve?
Well, we stumbled on like the fraud opportunity, but it was the catalyst was in recognizing AI just find it a much more interesting problem, or I was like kind of captivated by the whole essence of AI. Well, on the internet has always been a little interesting to figure out if the person you're talking to on the other end is who they are, right? Chatbots like MSN, like since like the beginning of, internet chat and discussion, like, do you really know who's on the other side of the keyboard? But the concept of identity, misrepresenting who you are with artificial intelligence, making it so much easier, that just seems to be that to me felt like a much more interesting problem, especially since these models are getting insanely good month over month. And I think it's going to become really difficult to discern the difference. So it was that, in addition to the fact that when we were talking to customers, we just noticed how differently they reacted to that problem versus the one we were working on, just from like a business opportunity and, business point of view. It just felt right. And that was the right direction to go in.
It's interesting because I think there's always a bit of an incentive for people to embellish their resume or the LinkedIn profile, right? So it's kind of like you're in a space where hiring managers are already a little bit circumspect, but now you're like, okay, going even deeper, and it's kind of like you could also be. Do you actually find that you are also running into some of that? Just like, okay, they're not trying to fake that they're where they're coming from entirely, but like you run into you find kind of lighter, less serious fraud or embellishment, shall we say?
Yeah, I think depending on who you talk to, a recruiter, there's such a spectrum of what people define as fraud. If some recruiter might characterize someone that's using AI to just help them get through the interview as fraud, and that's just cheating, or not even cheating, maybe in this day and age, because companies ask their employees to use AI. So can you use AI in an interview? We often get asked the question, hey, can you tell us if the candidate is inflating their experience? Kind of hard to do unless you maybe have the job description for when they got hired, or you actually talk to someone that worked with that person. We never stake the claim that we can do that. We're focused on the identity theft and the identity misrepresentation rather than the skill embellishment. But yeah, I think depending on who you ask, they'll characterize fraud differently. And we do often have to, help bring certain people back to like, that's not really fraud. Like this is fraud, or this is how we at least characterize fraud.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think, I don't know, it was about 18 months ago, some of my friends who I worked with at Meta or Google, they were, one of them was running a startup engineering team, and he's like, hey, sent a message to the group chat saying, hey folks, just be careful. We're starting to see some resumes in the pile that appear to be North Korean folks. And so that was one of the first times where I was like, wow, this seems like an actual real issue. So can you talk a little bit about the North Korean issue?
Yeah, I think it's funny because, well, it's not funny, I guess, but I mean, every single company that I've spoken to is affected by it. Like literally every single one. If you're hiring for technical remote jobs, like you're 99% chance there's a North Korean that's applied to your company. Whether or not they've gotten far or through is a whole other story, but there is an email, a resume, or a phone number in there that links back to DPRK. And I think there's certain companies that get hit harder with it, depending on the types of information you have and whether that lets, an individual like that either get paid more because that particular job in that industry pays more, or it has access to more sensitive customer information, where if someone were to get in and then hold the company ransom for it, that's probably a more lucrative like payout. But yeah, we're seeing, so whereas first, call it maybe a year and a half ago, was seeing a lot of just like fake LinkedIns and fake LinkedIn profiles and fabricated identities. Now we're seeing at least I see tons of identity theft. There's this really interesting article, I think it was on Trend Micro, or I'll send you the site, but it talks about how LinkedIn is just this massive hotbed for stealing data and cybercrime. And so one of the things now that we see is, LinkedIn account takeovers, if it's through a password leak or something like that. But then also a lot of North Koreans will assume the identities of people with LinkedIns that don't have profile pictures until you connect with them. Like if I were to go to your LinkedIn profile, Rob, and you didn't have a profile picture, I don't really know what you look like, or I can't necessarily explain what you look like unless I go deep diving on the web. And so they'll apply with those LinkedIns, create fake emails, fake phone numbers, because when they get on the phone with someone, the recruiter has to assume that's what they look like, rather than being able to corroborate it against the LinkedIn profile. So that I see a lot of that. I'm seeing we see a lot of deepfakes too. I'm starting to see more and more, and they're getting really good. And then, I mean, depending on how deep you want me to go, we can go like super in the weeds on it, but that's at least the shift that I'm noticing. And then I think there's just a lot of different entry points from where these people are like calling in from or operating, like Nigeria, Islamabad, Russia, China, places in South America.
What would you say is like where's the blame? Like if you had to say, like, what are the things that are most broken that lead to this situation? Is it like the hiring companies are just trying to move too quickly, or they're trying to hire people remotely when perhaps they should be optimizing for something different? Like, what's your kind of assessment of some of the root causes of why this is all of a sudden a thing? And obviously, you mentioned before, COVID was kind of a watershed where now people are hiring more remotely, or used to that, or have the infrastructure to support that. Yeah. Frankly, like mailing laptops to people wasn't as much of a thing, right? 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
Really good question. I think a lot about this. So I think because of how interconnected and also disconnected these systems are, I think when you go platform to platform, it just makes the like association of information harder, like to basically try and, as an example, you'll speak to a recruiter and they'll be like, well, I looked at the LinkedIn profile and it was verified. Okay. But now what happens is when a candidate applies from LinkedIn, then you hop off into an ATS, you've moved from one system to another, you lose that connection. That doesn't really mean anything anymore if a LinkedIn is verified, because, once you move into like the ATS systems, you lose that interconnectivity. And then, so if LinkedIn, I know LinkedIn is, works on this problem, but the lack of, I guess, ubiquity or interconnectedness between these platforms actually makes it harder to possibly like stop once you move off of one thing to another. And then obviously there's no good like internet passport or digital ID, so to speak, that someone can use, which is, which may or may not be something we're like trying to do. So I think that's one. It's just, what is the truth of source in terms of like identity information? I think that's first and foremost the problem. I think a lot of these platforms, a lot of companies have tried to solve this. Hey, like, apply to companies to this one platform and all that. But like those platforms just have such low utility other than finding a job that they don't stick. So I think that's one issue. The second issue is it's a security problem that's being where like the recruiter is the first line of pass. So I know security teams were aware of this, or like CISOs and directors of security and those teams had been aware of this for a little bit, but I think they were putting the talent acquisition teams maybe more on the front lines initially to solve it. Then you get into the budget issue of the talent acquisition teams, and maybe they don't actually have those budgets. So then it comes to a decision where they have to decide, do they want to spend on it or do they not? And then you have the talent acquisition teams that think they can maybe do it without something scalable. And so then they become, this house of cards that are letting these people through. And then confirmation bias as you move the candidate from one stage of the funnel down to another. And then they get to final round interviews. I think you're like more and more bought in on a candidate. You don't possibly think that it could happen to you. Then the person gets let in. So I feel security is being more brought in, or at least taking ownership of this problem. Actually, like I'm starting to talk to more CISOs. A year ago, I definitely think it was being pushed on TA. When we first started, we were reaching out to companies and they were telling us to kick rocks when we first started working on it. And then honestly, the majority of them came back to be like, hey, it's actually a problem for us. So yeah, I think, again, now it's being brought to light and everyone's in a reactive position. But I think for all of those issues across, hopping off different platforms and then a struggle of budget and needing and being forced to do, to meet your hiring goals, but also like add this level of security when you have finite budget, just are competing priorities that impact that. And I think this should probably start moving towards like the security budget.
That makes a lot of sense. So you talked a little bit about identity, and that's a huge can of worms to talk about. But I'm curious, like, what do you think of what I believe, folks like LinkedIn are trying to get people to verify? You mentioned obviously compromised accounts make verified accounts more valuable if they can be compromised. What do you think of LinkedIn and other folks' efforts in trying to, create some identity protections? I guess LinkedIn's working with Clear and other folks. What do you think about that whole area?
I think that unless there's like if LinkedIn forced everyone to validate their profile or you can't use the platform, I'm sure that would, I honestly wonder why they don't do that. I think you have to, I don't know, there's like a give and get, right? There has to be something driving the behavior. I don't think I'm verified on LinkedIn. I've never felt a reason to do it. To me, I don't know, I think that is possibly a microcosm of the whole challenge with getting people to verify themselves. Like, why should I care to do it? It's not regulated. So I think that, I don't know, if there's nothing forcing you to do it, especially with finding a job, hopefully, finding a job is not a consecutive month over month thing. It's, something that happens in a very short spurt of time and then you never do it for X number of years. I think it's something because that's so infrequent, it's possibly a harder behavior to enforce.
One of the things I noticed, so I've worked, obviously I've started some companies, I've worked at big companies like Google or Meta. And one of the things I've seen is sometimes folks who've worked at some of these big companies for a long time, they have a LinkedIn profile, but there's not that much information on it. It's like context, okay, Google, 12 years, and like, you have no idea what they worked on and that stuff. I'm curious how you think of like, some people just have really thin online footprints
Yeah.
or LinkedIn profiles, does that create issues in itself as well?
In terms of
Yeah,
identifying
like
whether,
feeling like, is this actually, I mean, this could be like the best engineer who ever worked at, say, Google, but
right.
like they wrote almost nothing on their LinkedIn profile. And we kind of sometimes overemphasize information, even realizing that some people might just never have an incentive to actually put that information on their profile
Yeah.
and email, whatever.
I guess it depends on like the use case. I think if you're looking for a job, you're really silly to not make it look like you are legit. Some people don't think about that though. Like a few really great engineers that I've worked with, like didn't have LinkedIn's at the time, or they just like took their LinkedIn's down. I think it behooves every single person applying to a job now to make sure that they can display some sort of information that gives the person on the other side confidence that they're a real person. I think the whole candidate fraud thing has become like really insidious feeling, where it's like you question everything, you second guess everything, especially as a recruiter, maybe if you don't have a security background, hard to understand. So I think if you're looking for a job, beef up your information, make it seem like you are who you say you are. I even see people putting their actual emails like in the LinkedIn profiles. You'll even see in people's LinkedIn bios to be like, I'm not applying for a job right now. Like I've seen that countless times because you have people that impersonate others. But again, I think there's this lack of incentive to do that. Right? People they're working at their jobs, they clock off, and I don't think they're really thinking about, well, someone pretending to be me. And then for the people that don't want to be found, that's deliberate. Right?
Yeah, totally. Totally. Well, what happens when a candidate, I'm sure this must happen. It happens with every trust problem, right? Of someone who gets flagged as an issue, or it's a bot, or it's fraud, or something. Like, does that happen often? And how do you deal with that situation? Because this seems to happen in every kind of trust and safety type problem. There's false positives.
Yeah, totally. That can happen often, right? I think genuine people can unintentionally show signs of suspicion without them knowing. I think one of the, for a very weak or light candidate fraud detection product that's not looking at multiple things, if you're going to index off email age, maybe people that apply to jobs with emails that they only use to apply for jobs will get flagged, right? Those emails won't show up on the internet. They won't be caught in the crosshairs of a data breach or something that might give light to someone being legitimate. I think probably hard to educate the entire job applying population that, hey, email age is a sign of authenticity, because you obviously want the person to be sharing that information. We're working on things to like we have things in our product that circumvent possible lack of digital footprint across email and phone. But I think it goes back to, again, like if you're applying to a job, try and find ways to like show that you are real, especially if you're an engineer and you know about this problem and you're applying to a job. Why would you want to make it easy for someone to not look at you?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if so Google just announced that they are letting you select another username for your Gmail account. So while still retaining access to the old one, I'm curious if that'll mess with some people's, because all of a sudden you have this new, never before seen Gmail address, but it's an old account. I wonder if that's going to mess some of these algorithms up.
Yeah, I wonder if that's interesting. I feel like the OSINT, I don't know, a good OSINT tool will probably have to be able to like connect those two, right? Going through like some, I don't know, password reset flows or whatnot to connect a username to a previous email, and then like link that back to go and get the data breach count, like first seen date, things like that. But yeah, that is interesting.
So when it comes to interviews, I think I've talked to a bunch of people who said, "Hey, we should be doing a lot of interviews in person. The person could be using ChatGPT to answer questions. That maybe it's not the. I mean, is this something you're seeing where you have a different person like interviewing as an expert, and like helping
Yeah.
people? Like, what's the range of things that you see in the interview process specifically?
So we are, maybe this is a good time to announce it. We are coming out with deepfake and proxy detection. It's actually already being used by customers to solve for two things. One, deepfakes, making sure that people aren't using AI to change what they look and sound like. And then proxy detection, which we call it proxy detection. You can call it swapping or whatnot, but basically like continuous monitoring of identity across the interview process, where you don't have a stand-in taking the technical round for someone who did the initial phone screen. It happens all the time. I think the more enterprise you go, where you have larger orgs, less likelihood that one interviewer will talk to another, that's going to happen, right? Because if we both worked at the same company and we interviewed someone, I think the less likely case that you and I are going to, find time to chat and be like, hey, Rob, what did Mark look like and sound like on that call? Like, I don't think those conversations come up. They're also a little PC and maybe taboo to have in the workplace. So I think that lends to someone's benefit who's trying to get through. But my personal opinion is, I think in 9 months from now, maybe like 6 to 9 months from now, the reaction of deepfakes and trying to solve for that is going to explode in the same way that people are trying to solve for applicant fraud detection or fake applicants, because I think these things are just getting so good. I had to reach out to someone a few weeks ago because we saw a deepfake that was honestly, this thing was so good that I don't think 98% of people would have been able to tell the difference. This guy actually ended up knowing that she was being deepfaked. I think a few people had also reached out to him, but it was actually there was a customer we had, a new hiring manager joined. I guess they weren't really aware that tofu was a thing at the company. So they were just like working inside the ATS and moved this person forward. This candidate was doing a technical screen and they were sharing their screen and they hit the F3 key. And so all the windows expand, right, on the Mac. And so you can see AnyDesk, Deep Live, right? And an interview response assistant. There was Google Maps open in San Francisco with the person's address, but also to be able to answer questions about where they live. You had like all this person's information. It was wild. And what was even crazier is it's not like, this guy in the video, he's getting up, he's standing up. You can see his whole torso and every single frame is kept intact. There's none of the waving your hand over the face crap that a lot of people like to use as a tactic to identify a deepfake. But this was so good. So I think that is going to be like the next frontier of like a holy crap moment where it's just going to get really good. And then teams will be scrambling for a solution.
Yeah, that's really scary. And unfortunately not unexpected because these things have been getting so good. Unfortunately.
Did you see I think it's like a Chinese company, but like one where you can just fully, I think it's for like social media influencers to change what they look like. But there's this app and it's scary good. So that I'm sure is going to make its way here really soon.
In terms of like the incentives for these folks who are trying to do this, like, is it essentially just, I assume it's not just, okay, I get hired for $80,000 a year and I'm pocketing $80,000. There's a bunch of other things that they're trying to do and other ways they're trying to extract value out of getting inside these companies. Like, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Or is that, how does that, what's the benefit to it, whether it's a North Korean or someone else, like getting one of these jobs?
Well, I'm even curious to understand, I'm happy to obviously answer that, but I'm curious to understand like how you think of that, right? You've been in this for a really long time, but I think, I don't know, if you get 10 jobs and you're hired for 2 months, that's a lot more than 80K a year, right? Multiply that by however many people are being forced to do this under, like, whether it's like the North Korean regime or some other, even if you're only employed for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, that's 40 grand in a month, possibly more. It adds up. So I don't think these people care about getting fired. So, if you can scale yourself and shop the workout, maybe you get away with it for a little bit. But then I think it's the it's the exact reason why companies have insider threat teams, right? Like once you get inside, I don't know if you get inside a really large organization, IP, IP theft risk, there's, depending on the company you infiltrate, there's lots to be gained with ransoming that company for large sums of money. Like what I guess are some of the, other than maybe like stealing secrets, corporate espionage, like from your friends that are in insider threat and things like that, like what are the top reasons that these things happen?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. Some companies just are very powerful vantage points for stuff happening in other places. Like, if you are one of the big platforms, certain kinds of data that they see can give people all kinds of insights. It could even be like allow you to insider trade on the stock market or whatever, depending on what flows that they're accessing. So I think it's often, I think I can see both angles, which is the direct monetary, benefit. I think also people generally don't think, I was actually talking to someone about a different problem. I was talking to someone about scraping video data and then like reselling it as AI training data. And the point they were making is like, we couldn't figure out the economics. Why would they be scraping our, I'm like, well, they're probably selling the same data to multiple different partners. And so, when you can do something like that simultaneously in parallel, to the point you were making about having multiple jobs at the same time, that's obviously very, a big benefit. But I do also think that there are these companies that are just at a strategic crossroads where they have, software that's on a lot of different machines and they could potentially be a distribution point for malware or whatever. I think I get worried that we barely are scratching the surface at understanding some of these things. And I only worry more about when agents, pieces of software are autonomously updating open source packages from multiple different entities, like the surface of the threats that we face just seem to be multiplying exponentially.
Yeah. So what you just said, it makes me think of like, I don't know, whatever movie has a villain that tries to get access to like the sewage and like the water system and, poison it with something or get in so that, because that thing just goes through the entire city and it goes into everyone's homes and the faucets and people turn on the water. Like, yeah, you're right. A company that is so interconnected and embedded in people's lives, like if you can get access to that, you can do a lot of damage.
Yeah, and I think what I'm also hearing from you is that there's this incentive / effort / expertise issue with the folks on the front line are perhaps incentivized to be moving people through the process. Obviously, hiring managers want to. I mean, unfortunately, we're at a stage now where sometimes hiring managers want to close candidates before the headcount is taken away from them, right? In some of these companies. So I think you have the folks on the front lines of this problem not always being either equipped or incentivized to address it as quickly as perhaps a insider threat security team might be. So it seems like that's got to be the next, way in which these things evolve internally at a lot of companies.
I think, and so one of the things that we even like will bring up in conversations is that, like, how many times does a recruiter need to send a hiring manager like a fake candidate where the hiring manager gets on a call for them to fully lose trust in that recruiter, and then that recruiter's job is in jeopardy? I think there's definitely two opposing forces. One, recruiter needs to find people and send candidates to the hiring manager. Otherwise, the hiring manager is like, where the heck are the people that I'm supposed to be interviewing? But on the other hand, you want to avoid the conversation of, what the heck, you're sending me people that like I shouldn't be that aren't who they say they are. Where are the good ones? Now you have a recruiter caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. I imagine also like, recruiters and these systems are already deluged with candidates, and this is a real, they're wasting a bunch of their time on I mean, do you have some sense or some enumeration of how much time is being spent by recruiters dealing with this kind of fraudulent candidate?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to like acknowledge your point before, which is, I feel like depending where your jobs are and the business model of that platform, they're either incentivized to just send the house and push all applications to your pipeline, whether or not they're fraudulent, right? So maybe consider where you're posting your jobs to. Like that is definitely a thing. I don't know if LinkedIn, if you're paying LinkedIn per number of applications, like that easy apply button is, it's like opening the dam. And then in terms of time saved, I guess it depends where you think about it. Like you have the AI resume screening tools, and now like fraud is embedded in within those. I feel like time saved is this weird like ROI thing. We always try to like, whenever we're positioning this, we try to do it like time saved is not like the thing we're necessarily leading with. But yeah, so if it takes you 10 seconds to review, a resume, and then you have 1,000 resumes, and then, divide by 6, so 166 minutes, right? And X% are fake. I don't know, maybe we're saving like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. What I think about it is like, what's the opportunity cost of you not having something in place, and how many candidates are taking up slots of genuine? How many fake people do you talk to a week where you could have talked to a real person? What's the recruiter like time worth? So I don't know, like $120K a year, $30 every like 30 minutes, $60 an hour that you're getting paid to screen people. Multiply that out, it gets to be in like the thousands of tens of thousands, depending on how many recruiters you have. I feel like that's more quantifiable than the hiring manager time. That's how we typically try to define it. Well, like the average fraud pipeline has like 56% fake applicants or above. I've even seen some with like 80%.
That's pretty bad.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time. But then it's also like, to me, that's the second order like consequence, which is like you're wasting time. The first is, if they get past that first call, then additional like confirmation bias of moving them through just puts them at a higher risk of being hired. Like we had onboarded a fintech company, and they had this candidate in final round interviews, and then the head of talent decided to run fraud detection, like tofu's fraud, on everyone past application review. And like this person that was in final rounds, like pending offer, they lit up like a Christmas tree on our platform. And so the recruiter then reached out to us and said, "Hey, I think you guys made a mistake. We're about to make this person an offer. We like just spoke to their references. Everything seems good." And we're like, "Well, you should reach out to the candidate on LinkedIn and ask them if they ever applied." Lo and behold, they do. And the candidate said, "Yeah, I've never applied to your company. You're the fourth recruiter that reached out to me. Is this the email they're using? This is my real email." I think for that company, a light bulb went off in their mind, being like, "Oh crap, we actually have a problem." So like that's what we're trying to help you avoid, but also time save.
100%. I guess my final question for you on this in this area is, look, I think there's some of this is monetary, time saving, other stuff. I think there's also some legitimate national security issues. Yeah. There's lots of other problems there. Do you think that there's a role for, either legislation or government need to step in and put some things in place to protect U.S. companies? Like, how do you think about that? Or is that a little bit premature to think through at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd actually put it to you. I'm curious, what has been like something that you never thought would have federal legislation pushed down, or, state legislation pushed down, where like now there's something in place for it?
I mean, I typically have the opposite concern, which is that, I've been hoping there'd be a federal privacy law for a really long time. And of course there isn't. And I was just in DC. And so folks were talking about, various anti-scam things that they want to put in place. There's also just such a patchwork of state laws around deceptive practices and stuff. So I think it's really tricky. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, we pin our hopes on regulation because we think that that's a magic solve for things, when in fact, the private companies doing stuff or they can move so much more quickly.
Yeah.
So I generally think that, yes, there is a role to be played. There's a role for lawsuits and other things too. But honestly, like, a lot of it can be just companies coming together and figuring out stuff that is in their interests and can also protect people and move things forward. That's often a better way.
Yeah, I feel like, that makes a lot of sense. When you talk about that, I think about Uber like being so quick to upend the taxi industry, and then things having to be reactive from that point. It's probably, you could probably have a few like of the biggest companies band together to do something like this. I think if legislation is going to come, it's probably going to be from something that really bad that happens. I don't know, like if a defense contractor were to suddenly get infiltrated by one of these people, and then it somehow becomes an issue, for national security, because now it's like with weapons. I don't know. I'm just random thoughts, but I feel like you have to be pushed to that point for something to happen. Otherwise, it's like probably not really a problem for them.
So you mentioned the deepfake stuff that you guys are launching or have been working on, and are there other things we should just be looking for from Tofu in the near future?
Yeah, so we're putting out something tomorrow, which I'm super excited about. This, we can do a whole recon of your ATS. So we can drop into your applicant tracking system, and in the same way that, a pen test does like a vulnerability assessment of your website or like your app or anything, we're able to help you. We can tell you immediately, like within 20 minutes, where all of the fraud exists in your pipeline. And so it's either really scary or really assuring that you have no problems, or that you have someone in final round interviews, or you've hired someone. I'm both excited and nervous to see what people's reactions will be, but that's we're trying to build, the security layer for this issue and this problem in this industry. And we also, right now, how I think most products are set up is you have to do a lot of button clicking. You have to create like an agent to go like scan resumes. It's based on, API calls. So you won't be able to figure out if you have fraud until you go and run something. We want to offer immediate value right up front with like the second you integrate your system. And so now any single customer that signs on to Tofu, or anyone that's currently on Tofu, is just going to have this like live, living, breathing, continuous monitoring recon system that's just going to be, swatting people away as they come in.
That's awesome. I think that'll give people a lot of either peace of mind or, rush to fix the problem, because it seems worse than they thought it was.
And it'll poke holes at all our competitors too.
That's always a good thing too.
Nothing better than saying, well, you think you have a good product? Well, why don't you hook this up? It costs absolutely nothing. And, we'll see who walks the walk.
I love that. Jason, really appreciate you taking the time to chat. Really excited to keep track of what you guys are going to be up to. And this is a very important problem. So I'm glad you're working on it.
Appreciate you having me on, and honored to be a guest in the presence of other people who have been in this industry far longer than I am. So thank you.